We're trying to understand what we can know about the Great Depression according to macroeconomic schools of thought. And if we look back at the Great Depression and see policies that were actually enacted, we can move forward to our fourth policy, wage and price manipulation, and see what macroeconomic schools of thought have to say about this policy. We have to understand that prices were falling at the start of the Great Depression, but not so much with wages. Why had wages not fallen as they had in previous economic contractions? Part of the reason was that President Hoover prevented them from falling. He had been appalled by the wage rate cuts in the 1920 and 1921 recession and had preached a high wage policy throughout the 1920s. Hoover held White House meetings and famously got a large number of industrialists to maintain higher wage rates. Hoover believed that high wages would support consumer spending and spur recovery. Higher wages were a symbol of wealth and prosperity, and so if we could keep these higher wages, consumers would keep spending, we would have that wealth, we would have that prosperity, and the economy would get back to its normal ways. He did more than just encourage these higher wages, though. In 1931, he signed the Davis-Bacon Act, which mandated that all federally funded or assisted construction projects pay the prevailing wage, i.e. above the market clearing union wage. And a year later, the Norris-LaGuardia Act that helped unions push for higher wages was signed in by Hoover as well. He also blocked immigration as an attempt to keep low-wage competition out of the country. What do we need for the classical self-corrective mechanism of macroeconomics to work? One thing that we need is wage rates falling in a time of recession. The new classicals would see this as inefficient and improper institutional design for a struggling economy, just as the classicals would see that we want to have these wages falling. As much as it may hurt, it helps us recover much more quickly. Even Keynesians do not argue with this self-corrective view where we have to allow wages to drop. They just feel that it takes too long and that in the long run, we're all dead. If we think back to our high school history teacher's story of Hoover being the laissez-faire president, letting capitalism run amok and swallow itself, it's pretty hard to square that circle. Controlling wages, in particular, is a massive intervention in an economy. Hoover was no laissez-faire president. One of FDR's top aides, Rexford Tugwell, later said, quote, "Practically the whole New Deal was extrapolated from the programs that Hoover started." He was at the helm for massive Smoot-Hawley tariffs. He increased subsidies, put in wage controls, increased public work expenditures, and had the US's largest tax hike in peacetime history. And telling our high school history story of Hoover as a do-nothing president and needing to have FDR come in and save the day, we should keep in mind that FDR himself said that Hoover engaged in, quote, "reckless and extravagant spending." And FDR himself also called Hoover's reign, quote, "the greatest spending administration in peacetime in all of history." Hoover simply was not the laissez-faire president that he sometimes made out to be. The high wage policies really stand as symbolic towards Hoover's interventionist policy during the Great Depression. His increased public work expenditures, the signing of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and this push for higher wages, even though the economy, if it self-corrected, would actually create lower wages, is all emblematic of Hoover's approach to the Great Depression. And it stands in contrast to kind of the stereotype of what he did. And his actions also stand in contrast to what our macroeconomic theories suggest he should have done. But what about FDR and FDR's go at the Great Depression? Many policies that impacted wages and manipulated prices were also done by FDR. There's so much here that we'll just focus on a few things. The centerpieces of his New Deal were the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, and the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, both aimed at reducing production and raising prices. The AAA started out with the federal command to slaughter 6 million baby pigs and reduce breeding. cotton farmers were also paid to plow under 10 of the 40 million acres of cotton in the United States. We are destroying production. We are reducing our supply in order to try and prop up prices, because higher prices make everyone wealthier. At least that's the theory. In this situation, the landowners of the cotton farms were supposed to share the payments with their tenant farmers, but they were not legally obligated to do so. And actually, most of them did not. The AAA had the idea of production cutbacks and having government purchases to take product off the market and raise prices. Higher prices is higher wages is more wealth means no depression. The NRA was essentially an experiment in cartelizing American industry. It's fairly akin to an attempt at fascism, quite frankly. The idea was to raise prices and reduce production and investment. You heard that right. Reduce production and investment. The goal of the administration was to eliminate, quote, cutthroat competition by bringing industry, labor, and government together to create codes of fair practices and to set prices. From this, they created the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, which allowed codes to be set and minimum prices that goods could legally be sold at. Individuals were arrested for not complying with these codes. A widely noted story is of a tailor named Jacob Magid who was arrested and sent to jail for pressing a suit for 35 cents rather than the required 40 cents. Some economists have estimated the NRA boosted the cost of doing business by an average of 40%. Not something a depressed economy needs for recovery. In 1935, the US Supreme Court unanimously declared that the NRA law was unconstitutional. The NRA quickly stopped operations, but many of its labor provisions reappeared in the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, passed later that same year. We can also think back quickly to the signing of the Social Security Act to see how drastically the economy's price system is being distorted during FDR's presidency. The first monthly Social Security payment was issued on January 31st of 1940 to Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont. In 1937, 38, and 39, she paid a total of about $25 into the Social Security system. Her first check that she received as a Social Security payment was $22.54, almost as much as the total amount she had paid in during those 3 years. After her second check, Fuller had already received more than she contributed during 1937, 38, and 39. In the end, she ended up living to be 100 years old, dying in 1975, and collecting a total of around $23,000 in Social Security. The price system is just being completely distorted here. We are sending money to some and taking it from others. That was the norm of FDR's rule. It was very interventionist. These wage and price manipulation policies of both Hoover and FDR are again not in line with any macroeconomic school of thought that we've covered, and are in direct contrast to the classicals and the new classicals, and very much against the spirit of the monetarists, the modern monetarists, and the Austrians. The policies that were implemented simply stand in contrast to what modern macroeconomics has to tell us about the proper role of government during a recession. Wage and price manipulation do not work. Come back for the conclusion of the Great Depression Macroeconomics in Review by clicking the video link shown here.